Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everybody for being here today. Happy Thursday. We are very excited today for our conversation on messaging tools to boost local news fundraising. And we have the honor of having our friends from Press Forward here today. They will be showing us and walking us through a toolkit that they have been working on, a messaging toolkit. So I will let them talk about it because they are the experts. But a few logistics. I am recording the session and we'll be sharing the recording via the follow-up email, and also it will be posted on the page. We have the slides, so I will be sharing the slides as well, so don't worry about that part. And we are going to have a Q&A towards the end of the session as well. So any questions that you have throughout the session, you can drop them on the chat. We'll be collecting them. Or you can also raise your hand during the Q&A. We love to hear your voices. We get tired of hearing our own, so please share. With that, right. With that, I would like to pass the mic and introduce my friends Marika and Alex from Press Forward and the Beekeeper. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Diana. I forgot I wasn't on mute and I laughed. I laugh a lot, so I apologize. But thank you so much for having us, Diana, Annie, all of Lenfest, and inviting us to present today and talk with you guys. And it's so nice to see so many faces live on the Zoom. So thanks for coming. I am the communications lead for Press Forward. And as many of you know, Press Forward is a network of funders nationwide with 41 chapters that works to strengthen local news. Funding is a large part of what we do. And we're so excited that our network has provided more than 400 million in funding since we launched in 2023 across the United States, in every state actually. But we also provide resources so that local news outlets can be more sustainable in the long run. And that's what Words That Matter, Words That Work is about. We commissioned this research because we wanted you to have research-backed messaging that you could use year-round to make the case for your outlet, so that the industry could make the case for itself, so that funders could talk about, why local news is important, all of that. And so I really wanted to introduce today Alex Dickinson. She's with the Beekeeper Group. It's a strategic communications firm based out of DC that did the research on behalf of Press Forward. So Alex, take it away.
Thank you, Marika, and thank you, Lenfest. I'm so thrilled to be able to talk to you all today. And I'm going to dive right in, and we're going to have lots and lots of time for questions at the end as well. I do have a little bit of a deck here, and I love to sort of start things off with a view of how we got here and what we were really aiming for with this research and with the end product as well. So I think first and foremost, we came into this process with an understanding that there were multiple kinds of problems that we needed to solve for, and there were multiple different opportunities that we wanted to plumb. And the first and biggest overarching question was, do people actually care about local news? And we wanted to make sure that we started off with questioning that assumption. And spoiler alert, the answer was yes, people care. But then how do we explain our value? So how do we support local newsrooms and anyone else who supports local news in really determining and defining the value of this work in a way that connects people to want to support it and makes them understand how it impacts their communities. And that's really what this third option is here too. This third question is, what moves people to support local news? And as we're heading into end of year giving, as we're getting closer to Giving Tuesday as well, I know that that framework and what makes people connect is top of mind for many, many people. And one of the biggest overarching notes that we had was trying to make sure that we were finding an emotional appeal, something that really spoke to people and helped them understand what this means in their daily lives. And that's going to come up a lot more as we dive into the toolkit as well. But first, again, I am big on context, and I think it's really critical to share how we got here and how we got to the end output of these toolkits. So we started the process off with actually, even before these in-depth interviews, a review of the existing research on local news and on attitudes. And there's a large suite of that content, which is really wonderful. And then we actually went through and started to look within the Press Forward network in particular, how were people talking about local news and how were people talking about the value? So really assessing and understanding what that language looked like. From there, we developed and worked on a suite of questions to ask in in-depth interviews. And that was with a mix of funders, newsrooms, and other key stakeholders who have critical points of view and perspectives that we knew we wanted to hear. After we had these interviews, we coded all of those conversations and understood that there were a couple critical themes that we really needed to dive in further on. And our first stop in that process was a public opinion survey, which included a couple critical oversamples. The public opinion survey surveyed 3,000 Americans on their perceptions of the value of local news, and also getting a little bit more granular and specific on the points of view and frames that would motivate them to support and that would help really enhance that feeling and that connection to action overall, to help them think about what would make them want to subscribe and support, and also see the value of local news in their day-to-day lives. Those oversamples that I was mentioning were spread across a couple of different key demographics that we knew we wanted to dive into a little bit. Specifically, we did an oversample with people who identified as conservative and people who identified as progressive. So we had both sides of that sort of spectrum. We also did an oversample for people under the age of 30. And we also had an oversample for Spanish speakers and Black and African Americans as well. After we got through that large data set, and it was a pretty hefty survey as well, with again a number of different kinds of questions and ways both approaching language, frames, and attitudes, we then took that information and went into focus groups. We started off with 3 identity-based focus groups. For this, we wanted to really focus in on the conservatives. So we did a conservative focus group, we did a under 30 focus group, and we did a Spanish speaker focus group. And then we shifted into 6 location-based focus groups, which were aimed at getting a cross-section of a number of different kinds of spaces and local news ecosystems out there. So we were really interested in making sure that we captured some rural spaces. So we had a Appalachian focus group. We were interested in getting a variety of urbanicity elements as well. So we were also in Atlanta. And we also had a mix within each area of both race, gender, socioeconomic status, and a number of other different elements too. From there, we were able to start to see a couple critical themes that were coming out. And that's really the first formation of the basis of our messaging. So once we started to hear some of the things that were really working with people, informed by the frames that really we saw in the public opinion survey were connecting with people, we were able to build a layer of messages. From then, we shifted into a internal message alignment focus group. So these were with press forward stakeholders, a lot of them representative of the same groups that we looked at in the in-depth interviews as well. And that was, in a lot of instances, going line by line across a couple different key themes and messages. And we weren't done, so we had to test some key messages again at the very end with a online randomized control testing of some core messages. And that also gave us the opportunity to slice and review by some of those critical demographics that we knew were going to be really important for us throughout this. The end result is a series of toolkits. One, again, focused on newsrooms, Words That Work, a toolkit for newsrooms, and another one that is a toolkit for funders. And both of these, again, are capturing that same goal and that same effort. But the newsroom one has more specific language that is going to talk about some of the findings that we had around around things that are more specific and important to newsrooms in particular. So both of these are available on the Press Forward website. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's in them and some of the key research findings as well that really underpinned a lot of this process here. Now, all of this said, if you take one thing away from reviewing all of this conversation and looking at these toolkits, it's a critical reframing of the local news crisis. One thing that we saw over and over again in our conversations were people who were tending towards the focal point being on local news deserts and how smaller newsrooms might be filling in gaps. And this is an important story, but it's not connecting with people for a couple of critical reasons. So one of the biggest shifts that we are advising is to shift from crisis to community benefit. So we don't want to say We're here to save struggling journalism. We want to focus on supporting trusted local news that strengthens our community. And that strengthening our community element is really important here. People understand local news as being a pillar of the spaces that they live and exist in. So where we can focus on highlighting that value, that's where I think the connection we saw gets strongest. A couple other key research findings that I want to shine a light on, and I'm going to come back to this in a lot more detail later as well. First and foremost, more than 8 in 10 say they feel they can easily find and access trustworthy local news. Now, that is the first complicating factor in the local news desert conversation. People feel it's ubiquitous. When we asked them, we actually went through and asked, what are your top sources for local news? We also followed that up with what are their top trusted sources of news. They actually aligned really clearly. They cited local TV stations, social media, and community newspapers. Now, those ranked in different orders for a couple different places, but that top 3 was always the same. So those are their top sources, but social media being in the mix is, I think, a really important note there. And nearly all believe that local news and information helps them build a stronger community. So wherever they're getting that news, they see it as integral to what they're getting out of a community space. And one other note here, which I want to call out because I'm going to say this throughout the entire conversation, is 70% of people prefer the term local to community. We actually tested that as a head-to-head. Now, when we are talking about who we are connecting to, I think it's okay to say community. We did see people have a deep connection to the idea and the concept of community, but when we're talking about news, local news resonated more than community news. And to get even more granular there, local news and information is preferred to just local news. It's a slight preference, but when you add that news and information, it does have a little bit more detail, and that helped connect things for people as well. So these are some key research findings that really go back to underpin what I was saying before about the need for us to shift away from a crisis framework. So this is why we are not talking about news deserts. Again, as noted before, people are seeing social media as part of their mix of local news. They're getting a steady stream of content. So they see this space as being filled up for them. They're not recognizing the absence because they are not information starved. So really what they're getting right now is a lot of content, but it might not all be quality content. And that's one of the differentiators that I think local news outlets can start to home in on a little bit more too, is what the quality of journalistic integrity really brings to this information as well. And really, most importantly here, as I mentioned at the beginning, we need to be connecting into emotions, and emotions are going to be one of the gateways into people's giving and into people's support overall. And negative framing is not motivating people to action. So when we talk about filling the gaps in a crisis, that's not helping people. When they feel like what they're doing is supporting their community, that connects with them more deeply. So negative framing isn't going to help with that. So a couple ways to talk about what we need to be saying here. First off, we want to say ensuring everyone has access to trustworthy, reliable community news. That's a priority for us. That's one thing that you could say instead of highlighting the local news deserts. Connecting communities through shared stories and local perspectives. You can see that that's where the function of what local news is doing can be community centered without saying community news. And also this understanding that local news is an accountability tool. And this came up in a couple different frames. It's a powerful frame, just generally watchdog accountability. And it, again, suffuses into a lot of the different ways that we were talking about that idea. And it's just a critical thing to hold in your heart and hold in your words as well. So I want to talk about a couple other research-based language shifts. And these are things, again, that came out. Some of it is repetitive, but it's worth sharing over and over again. First off, again, leading with the strengths and opportunity, not the news deserts. And this one we're going to talk about a lot more, but saying local news and information and not journalism. So when you look at the overall discussion of how to describe what we were talking about. I was previously saying local versus community. We also need to be really careful about where and how we're saying journalism. I'll get into that in a little bit more. Community works great when talking about that connection or of the community. And this is one that I thought was very interesting. It's something that a lot of times we fall into a trap of talking about things that are healthy and unhealthy. It's maybe something that's more on the funder side than on the newsroom side, but it is important to note that when we frame things as healthy and unhealthy, that seems to turn people's brains off a little bit as well. They feel like if something is called healthy, then the alternative is unhealthy, and that for some reason makes them, it raises their hackles. And part of what we're trying to do here is lower the barriers to entry for the connection and understanding here. Again, news as a community connector and accountability tool, we saw that over and over again. And I think the last thing here to that point is wherever we can emphasize practical outcomes. So when you are talking about what local news does, talk about how it helps support safety and accountability and civic participation, community participation as well. A lot of people, when we were in the focus groups, were talking about how they value local news because it helps them understand what's happening in their spaces and how they're connecting. One of the ways that we actually started this whole process was asking, again, what do you value in local news? And that feeling of participation and the feeling that you get was something that came up a lot there, that feeling of connection. But if you're looking for a shorthand for how to talk about all of the frames and sort of how to reposition the way that you're talking to your audiences, one thing that was really critically clear across all audiences and all segments was that everybody loves to tune in to their favorite radio station, which is WIIFM, which is what's in it for me. So if you need to think about how to position your content, help them understand what they are getting it out of it, what the audiences that you might be connecting into are getting as part of contributing, as part of being a supporter. So really connecting those dots for them makes a really, really big difference. I'm going to talk about some of the top frames, and that these were, again, things that we tested. And these may have shifted in rank based on different audiences, but these were ones that were top across all of the different demographics as well. So the first one is personal relevance. Local news helps you make choices every single day. You use these tools, these outlets, to guide how you are approaching your day-to-day life. That's really the hallmark of that WIIFM and what's in it for me overall. And that is one of the first things. If you can talk about how they use this, if you have any information about how they might be using your news in any way, that's a powerful, powerful place to start from. The next one is actually relational trust, and this understanding that people know the people behind their news. So this is when we'll talk about journalism again in a little bit. We know that people feel a connection to the people who are sharing stories. They understand that they have some sort of relationship with them as being part of a community, as being a reader overall. So it's something that I think is a helpful one to tap into and to really connect through overall as well. The third one here is really interesting to me, and it's the solutions-oriented frame. And we heard this a lot in the conservative focus groups and in from conservatives across all of the focus groups as well, which is that people prefer this sort of perception of news as shining a light on what's working or some of the solutions to problems as opposed to just problems. We also asked in the survey, what are some of the top things that you care about? And safety was number one for conservatives in particular. And but then when you probe that, it's this sort of like, okay, so how do we fix this? How do we sort of connect this? So if you can talk about solutions and talk about the solutions that local news presents, that's also a really powerful space to play in as well. Again, the accountability, which I mentioned already, that's going to come up in a lot of different ways and places, but it kind of is part of the solutions and the relationship as well. The fifth one here is crisis response frame. And this is one that I want to call out because I know I did literally say don't talk about a crisis. I don't mean don't talk about a crisis that is impacting your city. I mean don't talk about the local news crisis. So if there is a crisis that is impacting your community, the function and role that local news plays as the main purveyor of that information and transmitter of that information was very powerful. And that worked really across all audiences. If something happened in a community and they had to rely on local news, that was something that frame as that critical role that local news plays was built a deep, deep connection and deep relationship there. Similarly, the source credibility, so that stronger news means a stronger community. So the role that news plays in helping enforce and connect people as well. And the last frame, which is sort of a little incongruous compared to the rest of them, but also very interesting and ubiquitous across all of them, was that people want objectivity. They want to feel like the news that they are getting is objective. And respects specifically their ability to make up their own minds. There were some demographics that had a higher tolerance for subjectivity as sort of the counter to objectivity here, but everyone says that what they want for the most part is objectivity. And this is also reinforced by another frame, which we found didn't work very well when we specifically asked about it. So I'm going to talk about some frames that did not work. The first one here is local news covers topics that I care about but don't have time to follow. So we were interested in sort of understanding what was it that people were getting out of local news, and is it that local news that reporters can go to city council meetings and can listen in, and I don't have time to go to that. And that I don't have time to it, I think irks people a little bit. So if you can talk about it as instead, again, the community connection, the function, the accountability, that gets to a lot of that idea, just not highlighting, we're going to go do this for you. Local news gets me something unique that I can't find anywhere else. I suspect that part of why this is not working as much is because people do think that they can find this information in other places. Social media, their neighbors, connections. So really that positioning as unique didn't make as much of an impact there. Local news is good because I see familiar names, faces, or stories. This is not to say that people were not excited to share their stories of when they saw their grandma in the newspaper. They were that makes a big difference, but it's not why they care about local news. They're not looking for local news to be the thing that is shining a light on individuals that they know or that sort of deep relationship. That does spark excitement, and that is a story that you can use in storytelling, but don't lead with that. And then the last one, as I mentioned before, is this sort of local news should affirm my political point of view. Similar to the objectivity here, we don't want to lead with that. People overall felt like they wanted their news to be unbiased. They wanted their news to be without a political point of view. And specifically, actually, there was a difference in how people perceived national news and local news. And people perceived national news as having more bias and seemed a little bit more interested in the political point of view there. But on a local level, they don't want to feel that. They don't want to feel like there's that sort of political tension there as well. We have an audience quick guide that I'm going to showcase in a moment here. But again, a lot of this is really deeply enumerated in the toolkits. So just to give you a top level here, if we're looking at a couple critical audiences that we were specifically interested in, general public, what they care about, daily usefulness, how are we using this information? So the best frame to use is personal relevance. And rural communities, local voices they know, they care about having voices that are part of their community, that they're being talked to from within. And that's really leaning in on that relational trust. Conservatives, safety, I mentioned before, preserving tradition was also important, and that solutions oriented actually really connected on all of those sides. Progressives, on the other hand, really interested in that accountability language and action language. I'm going to talk about democracy in a moment. Progressives were one of the few audiences where saying the word democracy felt comfortable, generally speaking. But democracy is a word that we really want to be careful about. And I'm going to talk a lot about that in a moment too. We aren't recommending leading with democracy in most instances. For under 30, having shareable and visual content, they care about the content being consumable more than they care about the actual content in some ways. And they want that personal relevance. They have a deep appetite for feeling that they are part of a community overall as well. Spanish speakers, the family and community impact, and that personal relevance as well. And Black and African Americans, that government accountability language really worked, and understanding that news plays a role in holding government and holding power to account made a big difference, and that solutions oriented was really critical there as well. All right, I'm going to dive in on a couple of the nuances here, specifically democracy and then journalism as well. So we don't want to avoid the concept of democracy, but we do want to avoid the word. It is a polarizing term. It is a term that, while people like living in a democracy, as far as we heard in our conversations, and when you talk about it, it becomes a real moment where their shields go up. And again, we're trying to get their shields to go down. So although local news does play a critical role in talking about and connecting these things, when you use that word, it turns them off. What you can do is you can lead with some of the concrete benefits that people already value. So you can talk about how local news puts a spotlight on elections. You can talk about how local news is helping solve problems and giving that sort of deeper accountability. But let the audiences make that connection themselves. Don't hammer them over the head with this is good for democracy. You can, if you're applying for funding from democracy funders, if you are talking to, again, that progressive audience, maybe specifically, you can use that for already engaged audiences and funders. I'm not saying never, ever. I'm just saying as a general public rule, we want to avoid democracy overall. So an example of how we're recommending reframing that language. So instead of saying local news protects democracy, we want to try and say things like local news keeps you informed about decisions affecting your taxes, schools, and safety. So again, connecting into some of the impact, some of the ways that a functioning democratic government might have some of those trappings, and talking about those in the spotlight that local news can shine on those makes a big difference there as well. The next one I'm going to talk about was one of the ones that was a real like, ooh, for us, like stabbed us in the heart a little bit, but it's been helpful to talk through it and share where we got to with it, which is we don't recommend using the word journalism. And the gap doesn't seem to be about the work itself. It's about the label. People do really value what they're hearing and what local news does for them, but the word has really become politicized. So when you talk about journalism, it is a tough thing for people to want to support. Journalism was associated with bias overall, an opinion, and again, as a term, it was sort of associated with national politics. So even when respondents supported local news, they heard journalism and they thought national, not local. And local news and information, again, specifically tested better than journalism on a head-to-head term test in our public opinion survey as well. What does that mean for other words that sound like journalism, like journalist? That's something that I think there's a lot, we don't have specific data on in here, but what we're recommending is that you use journalist sparingly, but if you do use it, anchor it in the trust and accountability and the functions that journalists play. So you could talk about how journalists are part of the community. We live here too. Their credibility depends on the accuracy and fairness. And again, just if you're in doubt about something, try and pivot to phrases that we know tested well, like local news, local information. Community reporting did test okay, although there were some moments where it tested a little bit. Like community obviously was not the top priority there. Some words that always worked: independent, fact-based, trustworthy, accountability. If you can get those words in the mix, that's going to help really capture more of that trust. And for journalists, we're advising again that they lead with their functions. So talk about, I'm a reporter, I'm an editor. As far as we can tell, those things help people feel more connected and trusted overall, or our job is to provide fact-based information that you can use every day. So that sort of framing right there connects both to the personal relevance side and also to some of the key terms that really build trust. And just to really dive on that a little bit further, if you're talking about, local news and your function, you can really lead with the impact and usefulness. So connect into how your stories help people make decisions, how they help people stay safe, how they help people stay connected, and really framing your work overall around that community benefit by saying things like, our reporting helped community members understand XYZ issue. And when you can show, don't tell. So what's changed or improved because of your work? What stories have you all brought to the forefront? So really demonstrating that connection and fundraising and building language around that really makes a big impact as well. And then I wanted to put a little bit more of a spotlight as well on how to talk about local news. And I've said this a couple times, but I think it's really helpful to say out loud here too. Really understanding the role that local news plays in connecting communities. So it connects people together, it strengthens communities overall, and it focuses on things that matter to you, things that are sort of proven points that you can really build into. Uh, One thing that we also were really interested in testing is this idea of local news as a public good. And we tested this both explicitly in the survey and in the focus groups. The idea here is talking about local news as something that is sort of suffused into your day-to-day life, like a sidewalk or a street lamp. We were also interested in framing it as local news serves the public. In the survey, serves the public did test slightly higher, but when we focused on those two terms and two ideas head to head in the focus groups, they were actually equivalent. So you can talk about how local news is a public good in that way, and that evokes a lot of really powerful ideas for people. And you can talk about how local news serves the public. It connects people. It is in this sort of service journalism side of things too. I think one note on the public good that I do want to say is we didn't want to be super prescriptive on what public goods you compare local news to overall, because what we found is if you talk about local news as a public good, like a library, some people have crappy libraries and some people have places and spaces, they have a problem with their sidewalks. So just being attuned to your community and what is impacting them makes a really big difference there. When talking about why to value that news, local news, really focusing on how support sustains that service and your support, you are functioning as something that is connecting to a going concern. It's a longer term function, and your support is sustaining that. It's not filling a gap that exists. And again, over and over again, wherever you can talk about how local news keeps power accountable, can make a big difference for us as well. We did do a little bit of testing around subscriptions and what people sort of getting a deeper understanding of how to talk to people about that. And what we got there was specifically we found that 70% of Americans say they are willing to pay for local news that they trust. I think that the trust is doing a lot of work there, and building and having and forging a connection of trust is what's going to be the pinnacle for it. But overall, we know that people said that they subscribe when they trust the top source. That was the top motivator. When they see the personal relevance of the news to their day-to-day life. When they want to support their community, if they already have good, warm, fuzzy feelings about that community connection. And they also just sort of value independent and fact-based reporting as well. So those are some of the terms that we think could get pulled through, and some of the frames and sort of themes that you can pull through as you're thinking about focusing on the subscription opportunity. Words that built trust, again, just to say them out loud: fact-based, independent, fair, trustworthy. Although people like to see and have a sense that you are trustworthy more than you telling them that they're trustworthy as well. And then a couple other notes on making the case for support overall. We don't want to lead with collapse, but you can use the local news crisis as context. So this is this is not running counter to what I've said over and over again here, but if you need to talk about how a major outlet in your hometown has disappeared, that's okay, but talk about the function that your outlet and what you're doing and how you're connecting the community first, and then talk about how there's this absence, this gap sort of second from there. Also, making sure to balance urgency with agency. So giving people an action to take so they understand what they're doing, they understand how this is connecting, and they feel like what they're doing is making a deep, specific impact on what they're approaching overall. And then tailor your message for your unique audiences. This is actually probably the most important takeaway besides reframing the crisis overall, and why we have the toolkit in the first place. The toolkit itself is broken down by language for each of those specific frames that I mentioned beforehand, and with focused examples of messages for a number of different audience segments. So when you go in there, you can actually refer back to personal relevance and find messages that resonate with people who are under 30. And you can use some of that language that is sort of from our bank of proven and tested terms that came out of those conversations as a starting point for you. Whatever you do, though, tailor your message for your unique audience and take a look at what we've got and try and build something that works for your specific context. We knew going into this that there was not going to be something that was a silver bullet to capture everyone. The closest that we've come to is that personal relevance and the what's in it for me overall. But if you can make sure that you are trying to find language that fits the mold for those different groups and testing things, I think that's going to be the most powerful thing. I'm going to end with just 4 pitfalls and how to avoid them. So do this, not this, and then can jump into questions as well after that. So the first pitfall, local news is disappearing. Obviously, this runs counter to what we've been saying about the shift in the narrative. So instead of that, you can say local news strengthens communities. The second pitfall, and this is always an important one to keep in mind when appealing to the general public overall, but avoid using jargon. So we're addressing news deserts through hyperlocal solutions. Try and use simpler terms wherever you can. We're helping communities across access the local information they need. So really making sure that people, it's at a reading level that would be appropriate for everyone in your community as well. Abstract benefits. Again, there's an asterisk on this one because I'm talking about democracy a little bit, but supporting democracy and civic engagement. Local news helps you know what's happening at school board meetings and city council. Again, there might be some times where you're going to want to talk about democracy in particular, but generally that feels too big. It feels too abstract. Make it more specific. Talk about the specific accountability and talk about the impact, and that will activate people further. And then finally, doom and gloom. We have a lot of doom and gloom out in the world, and if we can, we want to talk about how local news supports community investment. So don't say things like without action, journalism will die. Talk about with investment, communities can have thriving local news sources. And that's really, I think, the biggest takeaway here. As sort of a side part of all of this, Press Forward has really started to focus in on this idea of a news story for local news. And if there's something to take away here as well, it's that I think that's a powerful path forward. Thinking about the real value that local news presents and functions in communities is where I think you're going to get the most opportunity to connect and motivate people to support you on a longer term basis as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then we can talk questions.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah.
And before you kick off the Q&A with Marika, I'm going to launch a poll. Hopefully you can see it, and I'll put it on the side here. If Press Forward was to do additional messaging research, are there any burning questions that you would like that research to answer? So if you have some thoughts, go ahead and please put it in there. And in the meantime, yeah, I'm gonna pass it to Marika and Alex so that you can start the Q&A. If you have any questions, you can put them on the chat. Some folks have already done that, but also if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, we would love to hear your voice as well.
I can start by reading one from the chat, I guess, from Jean Marie. If we're not going to talk about journalists, how do we distinguish what we offer from influencers?
Oh, a really great question. So we actually, and this is, we were interested in thinking about the function and role that influencers play in this ecosystem overall. And I think that there's possibly more overlap in people's understandings of influencers as journalists than we have time and space to dive into from a research perspective. But I think the most critical thing there is the fact-based and really leaning into the credentials that journalists provide and sort of um, the deeper way in which journalists their training and their work is showing and demonstrating that accountability. I think I would caution against poo-pooing influencers entirely in your messaging. Like, don't go against influencers because there are significant sections of the population that really trust the information that they are getting from influencers as local news. So you don't want to necessarily pit against them. And similarly, I think that the way that people see the relationships with reporters that they might be following could be parasocial in a similar way that influencer relationships feel as well. So I guess my big takeaway there is focus on what journalists have, which is a credential, a history of fact-based reporting, a history of accountability, and that sort of function, but don't necessarily focus in on the differences between journalists and influencers.
Um, there's a follow-up to that too in the chat. Could you say newspaper reporters, the first influencers, or something like that?
Yeah, I think that could be cute. It's worth testing for sure. Right. I mean, I think the biggest thing is you know your audience is best. So if something pithy is going to work with them and that sort of is a nod like that, I think that's a great thing to test for sure.
Great. I don't want to discourage people from unmuting and talking, but there are a couple more. So I'll pause after this question and ask again in case everybody wants to come up. But there are a couple of good questions in the chat. One of them is about the First Amendment. We've talked about democracy, but what about saying something about the First Amendment? This outlet has a beautifully in-house designed First Amendment heart that a lot of their true supporters really love. And it came out of Sunshine Week. But are, explicit shout outs to what the First Amendment too close to democracy talk, or are they okay?
So, there was maybe one or two focus groups where the First Amendment came up specifically. And I my that feels concrete in a way that democracy doesn't feel concrete in some ways. So my gut on this is I think it's probably fine. I don't know that it's like I don't know it's going to connect to everybody. I think there's broader challenges with civic education, so people might not understand the value of the First Amendment. So if you're really trying to go for a broad public audience, I might think about a different approach, but I wouldn't throw it out. I think it's a concrete enough benefit or a concrete enough idea, and there's value in those concrete elements versus the more abstract ones.
Okay, great. Um, sorry. How can local news outlets effectively engage and increase participation among younger audiences, particularly Gen Z, who are increasingly progressive and socially aware of today's political climate?
So, one of the biggest things that is not going to surprise anybody is that when we asked what the top outlets for accessing local news for different audiences, Gen Z was saying they were accessing that on social media, and that. And specifically, although social media was in the mix for all of the other audiences, when you zoom in and look at what platforms they were accessing it on, was really interesting. So they prioritized TikTok and Instagram over almost any other platform by a pretty large degree, whereas the general public and other age groups were on Facebook more than anything still. And I think, to me, I think a function of where you're reaching them and what kind of messages that you are sharing with them. When we did the under 30 focus group, we heard over and over again people talking about um, this value, like things that they're getting out of influencers, this sort of like, oh, there's this event, there's this thing. There were things that helped them feel like they were part of a community. Like they really identified with wanting to be engaged and connected to people. So leaning in on content that is talking about being a part of something, talking about that deeper connection overall. So yeah, I think the two things are the platform that you're communicating to them on makes a big difference and the medium overall. So focusing on things that are very shareable and very easy to access. And two, making it feel like it's personally relevant to them and connects into their deeper desire to be a part of a community.
Yeah, it's that action piece, I think, that came up a lot. Sean has raised his hand. Do you want to come off mute?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So our news match campaign, I'm sure a lot of us on the call have launched their news match campaign, and it's gotten off to a little slower start than I'm accustomed to. I'm not in panic mode, but I'm just curious because I've kind of got a theory that a lot of people are paying a lot of attention to their local food banks. And that's where a lot of their discretionary funding has gone, and such. So without trying to come out and, be tone deaf and say, gosh, we don't want to become their clients. Do you guys have any kind of thought behind maybe curtailing a message like, hey, don't forget about us over here too? It's just kind of something that's been running through my mind the last couple of days.
Yeah, we're in a really so, this research, we did this research earlier this year, and that was before the public media crisis. That was before, like, there's a lot of things that have shifted and changed in the landscape already. So I want to caveat this by saying this is not necessarily based in research and more just based on my gut feeling from having been immersed in this research all year. Um, I Although that said, one piece of research that we did find was a message that worked really well for funders overall was if journalism isn't your first priority, it should be your second priority. So if local news, if you are trying to local news is the thing that puts the spotlight on all the other causes that you care about. Now, I know that like in these economic times, people might not be opening up their pocketbooks to do multiple donations to multiple organizations, but maybe that isn't an approach. So something along those lines of if you care about your community, local news helps that community come together. Local news helps tell the stories that get you connected into these different spaces. And I think that's really my biggest advice here. I, I also think this is where segmenting your messaging makes a really big difference. If you have any data or any information about your subscribers, if you know that they've subscribed in the past or supported in the past or donated in the past, giving them a specific ask that might allude to there's a lot of things to support out there right now. Here's why local news supports everything that you care about, and connecting that line.
Alex, would there be any value to Sean's question about taking the narrative one step further and sort of saying, if it's not your first priority, it should be your second? And without local news, people don't know what's happening to their SNAP benefits, and they don't know where the food pantry is to go to, and they don't know what's happening to whatever is the crisis happening in that community at that moment.
I think there is the only thing that gives me a little bit of static is one of the challenges that we saw as a frame that turned people off was local news shines a light on things that you don't have time to cover or that you don't understand have time to follow. So I would balance it just a little bit in the language specifically, but I think that there's something to that message for sure. I think saying that explicitly can be helpful, but maybe making sure that you're not making people feel bad about it.
Yeah, no, for sure. And yeah,
Yeah.
not in a punitive way, but just sort of
Yes,
that's what local news is to make sure everybody has the information they need
exactly.
to, take care of themselves and their families or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Great, thanks. And Paul Fix has a question too. Paul?
Yeah, this maybe isn't directly related to fundraising, though in a way it is. We've been looking at um, outlets around the country that cater to specific audiences, the indigent, et cetera, and looking for ways to cover that and getting some pushback from churches and things like that that have ways to help people but don't want it broadcast. And I guess some of what we want to do is reach out to share that we're trying to reach those communities and looking for language that doesn't push back, doesn't push well-to-do people out of the way, but reaches people who need us most to learn where they can find help. Any evaluation done that might help with how that messaging, hits with people?
It's, that's so interesting. One of the things that we were very focused on was what does community mean as well? We wanted to let people self-identify as part of different communities and connect into things that they like that felt we weren't telling people that they were part of a community, they can opt into it. So I wonder if there's something around that of like what does it mean to be a part of a community and what does it mean to be connecting into those spaces? And we care about people who are experiencing XYZ situation. We're trying to shine a light on that. So maybe just highlighting that value and the personal relevance to people from that perspective. And again, how we're trying to play the role of local news as a supporter and a connector overall.
What do you think about talking about the whole community, reaching the whole community?
I think it's the same. I think it's very similar, right?
Yep.
If we can say, these are the values that we are espousing. This is what we're trying to strengthen this deeper sense of community and connection. Here's why we think this is so important to shine a light on, and here's how that sort of ties into everything. I think that gets closest to what we've got at least.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. There are a couple of questions around demographics. First is about was the sample for the survey nationally represented?
Yes, it was stratified and nationally representative.
And yeah, and if you want to dig a little bit more into who we sampled and who we oversampled, you can look at page 2 of the toolkit. It has it all sort of laid out there. The second one is about refugee and immigrant communities across the United States. The worry is that using the word local for reporting is kind of a misnomer for what they're trying to do, and that community driven is a little bit more accurate for that audience. Do you know of any data points specifically for immigrant communities?
We did not have any sort of specific questions that were connecting into immigrant communities in that regard, but this is sort of why I hedge a little bit on the communities versus local. Although it was 70% of people who preferred local to community, 30% is nothing to turn your nose up at either. So if there are specific audiences where focusing on the community over the local makes sense, then absolutely, I think it's worth exploring that. And I think, again, like just reinforcing sort of what I was describing before, what we want to communicate more is what the sort of parameters of the community is so people can see themselves as part of it, as opposed to sort of telling people that they are part of that community. So building it with them if you can as much as possible, as opposed to for them.
Right. We did go into, there is a section on how to speak to Hispanic communities, but it's not specifically diasporic. Okay, another question from journalism support organizations. How do you recommend that these groups message about their work and how they support local journalism if they're not actually doing the news gathering?
That's a great question. And I think The funder toolkit actually functions in a way that might be helpful to look at in particular for those organizations. One thing that is the like overarching messages and frames are aligned entirely, but we have specific language that is helping to illuminate more around communicating the value of local news on a bigger systemic manner than we do for the newsrooms, where we're really focusing in on the language there. So I would take a look there. But broadly speaking, I think it's still helping to illuminate the ways in which you function as a tool, as a mechanism to support local news. And you are maybe the local news as a public good angle is a particularly strong one to lean into. And local news is something that that underpins the strengthening of communities and the strengthening of communities at scale in particular.
Thanks. We have one last question from Liza Gross. And Liza, do you want to come off to say your question? Because I want to hear a little bit about the trust bridge. Do you mean building trust with them?
Yes. I love all this, all these insights, Alex, that you have presented. But my question is this: how it wouldn't be realistic to think that you cover one story with this frame and then, instantly you get results. So was there any conversation with sample participants as to how long would this process take? What would be needed from the information providers to establish a trusted presence?
It's a great question, and it's something that I would love to find a way to talk about a little bit more. And I want to, the two findings that I have that I think get to this. The first one is this. In the focus groups, we asked people what they mean by like how do they know something's trustworthy, and like what are some of the behaviors that they do. And a couple people were talking about how they check multiple sources, and they'll like vet something across in a couple different places. We saw that a lot more in the conservative focus groups or from conservative respondents and focus groups generally. So I think maybe if you're working backwards from that sort of behavioral action of they are vetting the things, helping them find ways to vet things, or helping them sort of understand and connect the dots. In a couple different times and places, we heard people talk about how really just like the structure of saying like, we talked to this person, they helped us see this thing, and like connecting those dots more for them. That's leaning into that solutions oriented frame a little bit more as well. But I think the biggest function there is really in the impact. And if you can show and point to ways in which you have made an impact already. We broke this story. We dug in on this topic. This helps in this way. So really connecting those dots, I think, more than anything. So that's sort of part one. Part two here is maybe like not as specific to what you're talking about, but there's a lot of really interesting studies and research around language that builds trust around democracy. So PACE Funders has a really fascinating study that they did that I've been referencing quite a bit in a lot of these conversations that I've been having with people. That talks about words that help build that like bridge those gaps in different ways. And there's never going to be a silver bullet there either. But I do think thinking about the behaviors, connecting to impact, and sprinkling in words that we know reinforce trust is probably the best place to start.
Thank you so much. We are at time, but this has been a very, very interesting presentation, so we are extremely thankful. I am posting on the chat right here a few things. If you want to join us on November 20th, we're going to do an AMA for the year-end donor stewardship. I put a link to the toolkit as well. If you use the toolkit or you have any feedback or thoughts, you can go ahead and fill out the form on the toolkit to give them some thoughts. And there is also the PF, the press forward updates that you can sign up on. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you very soon.